You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
It was the first day of school in September of 2012, and a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood at her locker in the tiny town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. She had volleyball practice next, so she threw a water bottle, a deodorant stick, hair ties, and a few other items into her backpack. Emma was excited that summer was over and they were back in school, but really just because she was excited about sports, not so much for her classes. She had made the varsity volleyball team, and now she was anxious to get on the court with her teammates. Emma looked in the tiny mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door, and immediately she grimaced at her reflection. She touched up her eyeliner and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Her acne was flaring up again, even though she was taking medication for it, so she put on some concealer to cover it up. Then she threw the makeup into her backpack and shut her locker. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the noisy school gymnasium and dropped her backpack behind the bleachers. She could hear the familiar squeaking of sneakers and the smacking of volleyballs as her friends warmed up for practice. Emma felt right at home as she ran out to join them. But about halfway through the practice, Emma began to feel really tired. And not the normal kind of tired from like working out or running around. Her feet felt really heavy and her heart was pounding. When she looked around, she saw her teammates did not seem tired, so Emma just pushed herself and continued running all the drills. But after a few more minutes, she felt so winded that she just had to stop. And so her teammates rushed past her as Emma knelt down on one knee to catch her breath. Emma was used to feeling very fit and strong, but now her chest felt tight and she could barely breathe. She staggered to her feet and stumbled over to the bleachers. Emma's head felt heavy as she held it in her hands. She felt a sharp pain in her throat every time she swallowed, and now she was starting to feel scared. Her coach walked over and asked Emma if she was okay. Emma silently shook her head no. Her coach placed the back of her hand on Emma's forehead, and she told Emma she was burning up and suggested she go home and rest. Emma nodded and then stood and slowly shuffled around the bleachers to pick up her backpack. She dug out her phone from inside and then called her mom and then told her she wasn't feeling good and needed to come home early. When Emma's mother arrived, she felt her daughter's forehead and saw she was burning up, so she drove Emma right to their family doctor. The doctor took Emma's vitals and discovered she definitely had a fever, with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So she was sick for sure. He tested to see if Emma had strep throat, a common illness among teenagers, but the test was negative. After reviewing her charts for a few minutes, the doctor explained to Emma and her mother that Emma probably had a fast-moving viral infection. He told her to go home and rest and that her symptoms should clear up in a couple of days. Emma was glad to hear that it wasn't anything serious. She didn't want to miss a lot of volleyball practices. But when Emma woke up the next day, she felt more tired than she ever had in her whole life. It was like her limbs just didn't want to move, and her lungs could barely take in any air. Emma cried out for her parents, Janet and Martin, and a few seconds later they ran into Emma's room, and the second they saw how sick Emma looked, they told her, "We're going to the emergency room right now." During the 25-mile drive to the hospital, Emma struggled to breathe. By the time they finally arrived, Emma was gasping for air as hospital staff helped her out of the car and onto a gurney. As a nurse wheeled Emma into a room, her mother squeezed her hand and her father followed close behind. The nurse's soft voice was very comforting as she asked Emma questions, but Emma struggled to answer even simple ones like where did she go to high school? Emma vaguely felt the prick of a needle in the crook of her elbow as the nurse attached an IV and drew several vials of blood. Then the nurse placed an oxygen mask over Emma's nose and mouth and picked up a phone. Emma could hear the seriousness in the nurse's voice. She wondered if maybe this was just how nurses sounded in the ER, or maybe this was something really bad. A few minutes later, the nurse wheeled her gurney to a room down the hall and positioned a large X-ray machine over Emma's chest while she lay there. Emma knew that the X-rays could not actually hurt her, but as the machine began to click and hum, Emma really started to feel terrified. What was wrong with her? When the nurse wheeled Emma back to her room after the X-ray, she turned down the harsh overhead lights and told Emma to rest while they waited for the results. Emma was grateful for the peace and quiet. She closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. An hour later, Emma was startled awake as a doctor wheeled in a computer and dimmed the overhead lights, pulling up a digital image of her chest. Janet and Martin, Emma's parents, stood up from their chairs in the corner of the room as the doctor began to point to all these dark, cloudy spots on the image. The doctor told Emma and her parents that the grayish cloud on her lungs indicated a severe case of pneumonia. The doctor explained that they could treat the pneumonia with drugs, but the big question was what caused Emma's lungs to become so infected. It could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or something else. Hopefully more tests would help them figure it out. But the doctor said that this small regional hospital was not equipped to run those type of tests. He was arranging for Emma to be transferred to the Sanford Medical Center in Fargo, North Dakota, almost 100 miles away. It was the closest hospital with a pediatric intensive care unit. Emma grabbed onto her mother's hand as an orderly came to wheel her into another ambulance. Volleyball practice suddenly seemed very far away. About 2 hours later, a physician at Sanford Medical named Dr. Sherry Richards rushed down the busy hall in the pediatric ICU and into Emma's room. Emma's mom sat next to her sleeping daughter, brushing hair out of Emma's face, while her father sat in the corner, anxiously bouncing his leg. Dr. Richards introduced herself to the parents and then walked up to examine Emma. And right away she noticed Emma had very shallow breathing and bluish lips and fingertips, and then she gently touched Emma's hand and it was cold. These were all symptoms of Emma's pneumonia. Dr. Richards smiled at Janet and Martin and told them she was going to prescribe powerful antibiotics to suppress the infection in Emma's lungs. Now, she wasn't sure exactly what was causing the infection, but these antibiotics covered a broad spectrum of disease-causing agents, so hopefully the drugs would help Emma start to feel better, while Dr. Richards continued to look for more specific answers. But the next morning, less than 48 hours after Emma initially felt ill, her condition only seemed to be getting worse. She had an extremely high fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, and so very little oxygen was reaching her bloodstream. Dr. Richards needed to do something drastic. She asked Emma's parents for permission to place Emma on a ventilator, a machine that forces air into the lungs when someone is struggling to breathe. Emma would need to have a tube inserted through her windpipe so enough air and oxygen could reach her lungs. Her parents hated the idea, but watching Emma gulping for air, they told the doctor to do whatever it took to help their daughter. Dr. Richards checked in on Emma every day, hoping that with more oxygen, Emma's lungs would get better. But even with the help of the ventilator, Emma wasn't recovering. Emma's heart and other organs were not getting enough oxygen to function properly. Dr. Richards was perplexed. She said to a nurse how incredibly rare it was for a young, athletic high school student to be put on a ventilator. Sudden respiratory failure like this did not just happen out of the blue. The most likely cause for what was happening to Emma would be some kind of viral or bacterial infection, but Dr. Richards thought that was unlikely for one simple reason. None of her schoolmates were getting sick. It was just Emma. So Dr. Richards took a closer look into Emma's patient history to see if there was anything about her on an individual level that could spark any clues. By all accounts, she seemed like your average teenage girl whose only regular medication was a very common acne treatment, meaning it was extremely unlikely that Emma's current condition was caused by a rare side effect from this acne treatment. Also, Emma did not have any relevant allergies either. So, to cover all her bases, Dr. Richards ordered a wide range of tests. She wondered if maybe the respiratory issues were caused by a blood clot in Emma's lungs, or maybe she had undiagnosed rheumatoid arthritis that scarred her lungs. But every test Dr. Richards ran on Emma just came back negative. Dr. Richards was totally stumped. And so she suspected that whatever was happening to Emma had to be extremely rare. It was so uncommon she couldn't find any existing records of similar cases anywhere, which also meant she couldn't find a way to treat it. It quickly became obvious that the ventilator was not enough to stabilize Emma's breathing. After a few days, Dr. Richards switched her to a more powerful ventilator that pumped even more air into her lungs, but even that was still not enough. There was only one option left, a very powerful machine that is normally reserved for patients on the brink of death. A team from the famed Mayo Clinic flew to Fargo with a high-tech, refrigerator-sized device known as an ECMO machine. All the blood in Emma's body would now circulate through this ECMO machine, which essentially takes over the job of her heart and lungs. The ECMO machine required surgery to insert all the thin plastic tubes into Emma's body, and her mother immediately gave permission to do this surgery, knowing this could be Emma's only hope. As soon as Emma's surgery was done and she was successfully hooked up to the ECMO machine, Dr. Richards arranged to fly her back to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There, Emma would be under the care of specialists who had experience treating patients who were as critically ill as Emma was. But this also meant she would now be 400 miles away from her home. As Dr. Richards watched the team roll Emma and the giant ECMO machine toward the airplane, she shook her head at the danger her young patient now faced. She was convinced that Emma's heart, lungs, and kidneys were so damaged that they would never function again without the help of this machine. Now, Emma's only hope of getting off the ECMO machine was to get new organs. But the wait for a 3-organ transplant could take months that she might not have. For now, the ECMO was saving Emma's life, but there was a catch. The longer she had to wait for new organs, the greater risk that she would die. Once Emma was settled in at the Mayo Clinic, her new doctor explained the situation to her. She was at the top of the priority list to receive her new organs, but there was no telling how long that might take. Emma fought to keep her emotions under control. In just a few short weeks, she'd gone from the varsity volleyball team to needing a machine to stay alive. It was almost overwhelming to process. But Emma refused to lay back and mope. She was determined to regain control of something in her life. So she told her doctor she wanted to walk. She saw the doctor look at her with amazement. He encouraged her to go for it, but he also gently told Emma that given her condition, he wasn't sure that she could even muster the energy to stand, let alone take a step. And even if she could, she'd have to drag along this massive ECMO machine and all the tubes and monitors that came with it. But as an athlete, Emma was familiar with the importance of a good attitude. She knew she was physically weak, but she was also very determined. With enough time and effort, she was certain she could eventually walk on her own. So Emma asked some nurses to help her sit up and place her feet on the floor. She was so dizzy that her head spun, and she had to lie down again almost immediately. But Emma refused to give up. She tried again the next day and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer. And the next day, she sat for even longer. Eventually, Emma was strong enough that she was able to actually stand up, albeit she had to hold on to her mom for support. And then it wasn't long after that Emma was straight up walking out of her room and standing in the hall without her parents' help. Finally, Emma managed to make it all the way down the 60-foot-long corridor to the hospital chapel. And there, Emma tasted her first solid food since she'd been hooked up to the ECMO machine. It was just a communion wafer, but Emma could not believe how good that dry, stale cracker tasted. One morning, after more than 6 months at the Mayo Clinic, Emma's doctor came into her room to review the latest readout from her ECMO machine. As he walked over to it, he smiled down at Emma, who was in bed tapping on her phone. The doctor felt so bad for Emma because she was in this impossible situation, but he was also very proud of Emma for really handling this situation with grace. She was so optimistic and so positive, even though most people would be totally devastated and depressed. The doctor looked at the numbers from the ECMO machine and had to do a double take. He wondered if he was actually misreading the data. Emma looked up from her phone and asked him what was going on, and Emma's doctor told her that her blood pressure, heart rate, and blood oxygen levels all seemed to be improving. He had no explanation for why this was happening, but given the numbers he was seeing, Emma's organs might have recovered enough to function without the help of the ECMO. Doctors still had no idea what had made Emma sick in the first place, but almost miraculously, she appeared to be getting over it. After more than 6 months on the ECMO machine, the tubes in Emma's body were finally removed and she was officially disconnected from the machine. She never got a transplant because she didn't need one. Her organs had mysteriously recovered all on their own. Finally, on a spring day in 2013, Emma left the hospital for good. She had been in the hospital for a total of 7 months with a mystery disease that had baffled some of the best doctors in the world. Now, Emma could return to normal life as an active teenager. But a dark shadow hung over Emma. The doctors had never figured out what was making her sick. So what was to stop it from striking her again, or somebody else in the future? 2 years later, Emma and her parents returned to the Mayo Clinic for a checkup. She'd been coming every 6 months since being discharged, and so far there were no lingering issues from her mystery disease. Emma cheerfully greeted the medical staff as a nurse led her down the hospital's halls into an exam room. While the nurse took Emma's vitals, she remarked how happy all the staff was that Emma had made this full recovery, but then the nurse's face grew serious. The nurse told Emma that there was actually a 12-year-old girl at the hospital currently being treated for the same bizarre symptoms that Emma had experienced. Her lungs had stopped working and nobody knew why, and just like Emma had been, this 12-year-old was currently hooked up to an ECMO machine while awaiting an organ transplant. Emma was shocked to hear this. She held back tears as the memories of her own time on the ECMO machine came flooding back to her. She wanted to do everything she could to help this girl, and so Emma asked if maybe she could meet with the girl's parents. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, Emma and her parents sat down with the 12-year-old girl's parents in the hospital cafeteria. And over some hot coffee, they compared their respective histories. At first, the two girls' cases didn't seem to actually have that much in common. But then, Emma remarked that she hoped this other girl at least didn't have the same skin problems that she, Emma, had dealt with when she was younger. The girl's mom laughed and said that her daughter had acne, but not any worse than any other teenager. The mother said that she was taking some medication for it, but it was an extremely common medication. It would turn out that both this girl and Emma were taking the same acne medication, called Bactrim, also known generically as TMP-SMX. The families would shake hands and go their separate ways, and then unfortunately, the 12-year-old girl would eventually die from the mystery condition. Three years later, in March of 2018, Emma, who was now 21 years old, sat at her desk in her modest one-bedroom apartment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the news on her laptop. She clicked on a headline and her jaw dropped. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was a story about a 16-year-old high school student in Wichita, Kansas, named Z Uwadya. She was an athlete who played on several sports teams, but then her lungs just suddenly stopped working, and now Z was relying on an ECMO machine to survive. Emma couldn't believe the similarities between Z's story and her own. It made Emma also think back to that little 12-year-old girl who died a couple years back. Since then, Emma had heard about another teenager experiencing the same thing, and she too had also taken Bactrim, or TMP-SMX. Emma wondered if maybe Z, this person in this headline, was taking Bactrim as well. For years now, this suspicion about Bactrim had lingered in the back of Emma's mind, and now she was more certain than ever that this common medication was what had made them all so sick. Emma found an email address for the doctor who was treating Z, and she wrote to her immediately. Dr. Jenna Miller, who was caring for Z at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was catching up on paperwork when her inbox pinged. There was a message from a woman named Emma who said that she'd experienced something similar to Z, and she wanted to know if Z had taken Bactrim, because Emma had taken Bactrim, and so maybe that was a commonality. On one level, Dr. Miller thought it was highly unlikely that such a common drug could cause such a horrific reaction. Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is the 6th most prescribed antibiotic in the entire United States. It's used to treat many different conditions. Then she remembered something. She scoured Z's files to confirm it. For several weeks before Z was admitted to the hospital, she had been suffering from a urinary tract infection. And the antibiotic that she was taking to treat it was Bactrim. Dr. Miller wrote back to Emma and told her that she very well might have just solved the mystery behind Z's condition and Emma's own horrible illness. It turned out all the girls with this mystery illness had taken Bactrim, TMP-SMX, shortly before being hospitalized. And when the doctors examined images of the girls' lung tissue samples, they discovered that they had all suffered the same kind of tissue damage. For some reason, the Bactrim was systematically destroying the cells responsible for breathing. Over the next 4 years, Dr. Miller searched patient records across the country for people who'd suffered inexplicable respiratory failure shortly after taking this drug. They identified 19 other cases, mostly young men and women under the age of 20. 6 had died, including Z. Uwadya. No one knows why the antibiotic sometimes triggers this rare lung destruction, but Dr. Miller and her colleagues suspect that in rare cases, people's bodies have a potentially deadly allergic reaction to the drug. Today, Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is still widely prescribed, but acute lung failure is now listed as a potential side effect. Emma is now 26 years old, and she works as a nurse who cares for patients who've just had heart and lung transplants. Emma knows that because of her reaction to Bactrim, which caused all this damage in her body, she can never be a serious athlete again. She gets winded after climbing a couple flights of stairs. But considering that she very nearly died, she doesn't mind at all. It was December 1979, and a young woman named Rose Harmon shivered in the cold at a bus stop in Madison, Wisconsin. The ground was covered in icy gray slush, and the whipping wind chilled her to the bone. But still, Rose couldn't help feeling cheery. All the lampposts around her were decorated with Christmas lights, and she just loved the way the city looked this time of the year. The 18-year-old high school student shifted her backpack from one shoulder to the other as her bus finally arrived at the stop. When the hydraulic doors opened, Rose stepped on board, and immediately it hit her how much warmer it was inside of the bus than it was outside, to the point where her cheeks flushed and she lowered the hood on her jacket. But as she walked towards the back of the bus, it just felt like the temperature inside the bus was only rising. Rose unbuttoned her parka, but it didn't help. She began sweating, and then suddenly Rose felt so overheated she could barely breathe. The edges of her vision went dark as she tried her best to gulp down air and get her coat off. She could hear people around her reacting to her strange, desperate behavior. Someone was telling the bus driver to pull over, call an ambulance. And then Rose felt a sharp pain in her knees as she collapsed to the floor, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Dr. Russell Chesney made his way to the intensive care unit at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. Dr. Chesney was a kidney specialist, and any time he was paged to go to the ICU, it was usually bad news. And tonight was no exception. He just received a call from the emergency room letting him know that they were rushing a patient named Rose Harmon up to the ICU for kidney failure. When Dr. Chesney reached Rose's room, he saw a doctor standing at the foot of her bed, scribbling something down on a medical chart, while a nurse rummaged through a black backpack that was sitting on the cabinet along the wall. The doctor at the foot of the bed looked up as Dr. Chesney came inside the room, and the doctor kind of motioned to the unconscious young woman lying right there in the hospital bed with the oxygen mask strapped over her face. Dr. Chesney looked at Rose and felt his chest tighten. He knew Rose was only 18 years old, but in person, she looked even younger. She was far too young to be suffering from kidney failure. Dr. Chesney stepped closer to the bed and noticed that the girl's face and hands were covered in a blotchy pink rash that made it look like she was very badly sunburned. The doctor who had already been in the room told Dr. Chesney that Rose had come into the ER unconscious and with a very high fever. She was barely breathing, and when the doctor performed an initial exam, he heard crackling in her lungs. It was a warning sign that her lungs were filled with fluid, and they needed to perform a procedure to drain them. However, before they could extract the fluid, Rose's kidneys began to fail, and so that was when they had called Dr. Chesney. Dr. Chesney couldn't believe how quickly Rose seemed to be breaking down, and Dr. Chesney had never seen anything like this list of symptoms she had, especially her sunburn-like rash. He knew that Rose's body was in shock, which meant that it wasn't properly able to pump blood to all her organs. That was why her lungs and kidneys were failing. But he had no idea why Rose's body had gone into shock in the first place. And in order to save Rose, that was the question that Dr. Chesney would have to answer. Otherwise, even if he could stabilize her right now, she would eventually go back into shock. Given the rapid onset of Rose's symptoms, Dr. Chesney guessed that she must have contracted a very serious infection. He needed lab work to better understand what was wrong with Rose, but there was no time to wait for test results, which could take up to a couple of days. She needed help right now. A moment later, the nurse returned and told Dr. Chesney that she'd found Rose's ID in her backpack and contacted her parents. Dr. Chesney thanked the nurse and gave her a new task: to start Rose on a few different antibiotics. He hoped that one of them would stop the infection from spreading. And in the meantime, after they used a long needle to drain the fluid from her lungs, he would order as many tests as possible to identify the source of the infection. Dr. Chesney also decided to put Rose on dialysis, meaning a machine would now be flushing toxins from her kidneys, since her own kidneys were not able to do that. They were failing. While the nurses got everything started, Dr. Chesney left to go check on some other patients and promised he would be back soon. An hour later, Dr. Chesney turned back into Rose's room. The sunburn rash had spread up her arms, making her look even worse. He checked her vitals and was dismayed at what he saw. Rose's blood pressure had fallen, which meant that her body was not coming out of shock. So Rose's body still was not pumping enough blood to her organs. Dr. Chesney decided to give the antibiotics one more hour to maybe work. It was nearing the end of his shift, but he wanted Rose to stabilize before he left the hospital. But when Dr. Chesney came back to check on her the next time, he could immediately tell the antibiotics were still not working. The rash had spread even more. Now it fully covered Rose's arms and legs. Her blood pressure was even lower than before. Dr. Chesney was bewildered. The antibiotics should be able to fight off a wide variety of infections, so whatever Rose was fighting had to be extremely rare and very potent. Dr. Chesney clearly could not afford to sit around and wait for Rose's test results to come back, otherwise it would be too late to help her. So he ordered a chest x-ray, thinking maybe it would reveal that she had a bad case of pneumonia. As orderlies wheeled Rose's gurney toward the x-ray suite, a nurse came into the room and told Dr. Chesney that Rose's parents had arrived at the hospital. Dr. Chesney immediately hurried out into the waiting room, meeting the parents right as they stepped off the elevator. Dr. Chesney was anxious to speak with them about Rose's health and felt a pang of empathy at the looks of sheer terror on their faces. Dr. Chesney invited them to sit with him for a moment. He explained that Rose was getting a chest x-ray and they could see her after that. And in the meantime, he asked her parents to walk him through Rose's medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if she'd been sick at all in the past week, or if anyone around her at home had been sick. But Rose's parents shook their heads, no. The mother assured the doctor that they'd all been feeling fine. They also hadn't received any word of any illnesses circulating at Rose's high school either. And the more they talked about Rose's medical history, the more it became apparent to Dr. Chesney that Rose was a very healthy, average 18-year-old girl. And so Dr. Chesney was stumped. Dr. Chesney didn't have any more questions to ask, so he thanked her parents and promised he'd come get them the moment they could see their daughter. Then he turned on his heels and hurried back down the hallway towards Rose's room, anxious for the results of her x-ray. Thankfully, as soon as Dr. Chesney arrived, Rose's nurse was putting up all the x-rays on a light box so he could look at them. And Dr. Chesney took one look at the x-rays and he gasped. Rose did not have pneumonia, but the reason she was having trouble breathing was very obvious. There was bleeding in her lungs. Dr. Chesney could clearly see that Rose's symptoms were getting more and more dire. But almost worse than that, they seemed kind of random and disconnected. They were not pointing him anywhere. There was one piece of good news, though. When Dr. Chesney checked Rose's vitals, he saw that her blood pressure was rising. This meant the treatments they were doing were finally working, and Rose was coming out of the shock. And so Dr. Chesney decided that Rose was stable enough for her parents to come see her, even if she would not be awake. So he turned out of Rose's room and headed back to the reception area where Rose's parents were waiting patiently, still looking absolutely terrified. He called them over and then led them back into their daughter's room, standing back to give them room by her bedside. He told the parents that, in his opinion, Rose would likely regain consciousness as her body stabilized. But what Dr. Chesney did not tell them was that he had no idea why their daughter's lungs were bleeding. He also had no idea why she landed in the hospital in the first place. Her symptoms were just totally confusing. And so Dr. Chesney knew he would need to consult with someone he trusted. So Dr. Chesney said goodnight to Rose's parents, and he left the hospital and made his way to the home of a respected colleague. It also happened to be his own home. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chesney's wife, Joan, had just thrown 2 chicken breasts in the oven when she heard keys rattling in the front door, then a familiar sound of footsteps moving through their foyer. Joan turned to greet Dr. Chesney as he walked into the kitchen and threw his car keys on the built-in desk near the fridge. He had a distant look on his face, as though he were lost in thought. Joan frowned. She could tell that her husband was stressed out about something. As she pulled more vegetables from the fridge, she asked him what was wrong. Dr. Chesney sighed and told her all about his new patient, Rose, and her baffling list of symptoms. He was at a total dead end, and he needed his wife's help to figure out what was wrong with her. Joan nodded and put down her knife so she could think. Dr. Chesney's request was not unusual because Joan was also a doctor. The couple frequently bounced ideas off of each other when they had challenging cases. Joan was an infectious disease specialist, and odd cases like this came across her desk all the time. And to Joan, something about Rose's symptoms, the fever, shock, and kidney failure, sounded familiar, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember why. Joan asked more questions about Rose, hoping that something might jog her memory, but she had no luck. She promised her husband she'd keep thinking about it, and then she went back to chopping up the vegetables. Now she was lost in thought as well. When Joan woke up the next morning, Rose was immediately on her mind. In fact, the night before, she had even had a dream about Rose. It felt like the answer to what was going on with Rose was just beyond her fingertips. As Joan got out of bed, she decided she would pay Rose a visit herself that morning. She thought that maybe just seeing Rose in person might help her put the pieces together. An hour later, Joan followed her husband, Dr. Chesney, into Rose's room in the ICU. Joan was shocked as she laid eyes on Rose, who was still unconscious. The sunburned-looking rash now covered Rose's entire body, including the palms of her hands. Joan had never seen a rash like this in her entire career. She thought it looked almost like a chemical burn and wondered aloud if Rose could have been exposed to a chemical that her body absorbed through her skin. Or maybe she took a drug that her parents were not aware of at maybe a high school party or something like that. Dr. Chesney told his wife that the lab results should be ready any moment, and hopefully they would help them find an answer. Dr. Chesney said he'd go check on the test results' progress, and then he stepped out of the room. While Joan waited for him to come back, she decided to check Rose's pupils and her reflexes. So Joan pulled a flashlight from the pocket of her white lab coat and then gently pulled back Rose's eyelids. Joan was surprised to see that Rose's eyes were totally bloodshot. Joan was alarmed. She didn't know of any infections that caused shock and bloodshot eyes like this. She began to wonder if they were witnessing the birth of some new and potentially deadly disease. The prospect was terrifying, and it sent Joan hurrying out of the room and down the hallway to find her husband. Two mornings later, Joan was on her way out of the hospital to attend a local conference on infectious diseases. Rose's test results had finally come back, but they were inconclusive. Thankfully, Rose had finally woken up and was stable for the time being. But Joan and her husband were not any closer to solving her case. Joan hoped that talking to some colleagues at this conference might help her come up with some new ideas. But before she could leave the building, she received a page calling her down to the ER. This was unusual. She wondered why an infectious disease specialist would be needed in the emergency room. But in the pit of her stomach, she feared she already knew the answer. That she was right, that Rose was suffering from some brand new deadly disease, and now it was spreading, and so they might have new patients downstairs. Joan hustled across the hospital, anxiety really starting to settle in. Moments later, she rushed into the ER to find another young woman lying on a gurney covered in a sunburn-like rash who was also struggling to breathe. An ER doctor was helping two nurses wheel the patient into a hospital room. As Joan walked beside them, the doctor told her that the patient was a 15-year-old girl who had collapsed in her kitchen. Like Rose, this new patient had developed her symptoms suddenly, and her parents had rushed her to the hospital right after she'd collapsed. Joan suddenly felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that two young women with the same bizarre symptoms could not be a coincidence. But she didn't have time right now to worry about a potential new epidemic. The patient in front of her was crashing. Joan followed the ER doctor into the patient's room, and as she did, she told the doctor the exact cocktail of IV fluids and dialysis that her husband, Dr. Chesney, had given to Rose. The ER doctor thanked Joan for saving him a call up to the ICU. Joan gave him a grim smile. She knew this treatment she had suggested would likely stabilize this new patient for the time being, but she knew it would not cure her. Joan looked down at her watch and realized she might be late for this conference, and so she needed to leave right now. She needed to attend this conference really for the sake of Rose and this new patient. Joan hoped that one of her colleagues at this conference might recognize the symptoms these two girls were showing and be able to help figure out what was making them sick so they could finally treat them and cure them. An hour later, Joan walked into a large lecture hall, a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand. The desks had all been arranged in a big circle, and so Joan took a seat on the far side of the room. There were already a few colleagues getting settled, and so Joan waved at a friend as she set her things down and took out her notepad. All morning, specialists took turns presenting cases that involved different infectious diseases. Some had been solved, and others still needed to be diagnosed. They were all interesting, but it was the last case that caught Joan's attention. The speaker handed around copies of a file for one of his current patients. She was a 25-year-old woman, also local to the area, and just like Rose and the 15-year-old girl at the hospital, this patient had also experienced sudden kidney failure, a high fever, and a sunburn-like rash. The presenter broadly described the diagnosis as kidney failure with shock, although they had no idea what had caused her kidneys to fail in the first place. As soon as the presentation was over, Joan hurried over to the last speaker to talk to them about their patient and maybe compare notes. The two doctors looked over the patient's files together, and quickly they saw all three cases were basically identical. The other doctor looked at Joan hopefully and asked if she'd been able to figure out what was making these young women go into shock. Joan just shook her head. She said she was still trying to figure it out, and in fact, that was why she had come over to talk to this doctor, because she was hopeful that they had the answer to what was going on. And so Joan silently ran over the symptoms again in her head, trying to put the pieces together, and then out of nowhere, it just clicked. Suddenly, Joan remembered where she had read about this disease before, in a journal article published a year earlier. That was why, when her husband, Dr. Chesney, had come home and first told her about the symptoms Rose was showing, they seemed so familiar. This article was the reason. Joan quickly thanked her colleague and promised she'd be in touch. Then she hurried out the door and drove back to the Madison Medical Center as fast as she could, and then nearly ran to her office. Once she got there, she began rummaging through the stacks of articles and journals that she'd spent the past 2 days piling up on her desk. Finally, she found the one she'd been looking for. It was in a medical journal called The Lancet. Joan flipped through the pages and found the article that had been published a year earlier. It described the case of an adolescent girl who'd suffered the exact same rashes and other symptoms as Rose and the other two patients. The article described how the girl had contracted a strange new illness caused by a potentially deadly bacteria that entered her body through an open wound. The result, the researchers concluded, was a disease that had never been seen before. Joan tapped her foot, thinking. The symptoms matched, but neither of her patients had any open wounds on their bodies. There was clearly some piece of the puzzle that was still missing. Joan decided to order one more test for both Rose and the 15-year-old girl to see if they were infected with the same bacteria as the girls referenced in this article. In a day or two, she would know whether her current cases and the cases from this article were actually linked. But in the meantime, she knew that if there were already 3 cases of this potential bacterial illness, there would be more. and so she decided it was now time to call the Wisconsin Department of Public Health and tell them they had a potentially very big problem on their hands. The next afternoon, Joan was sitting in her office catching up on paperwork when a tall man wearing a nice suit knocked on her doorframe. He looked anxious and out of breath as he introduced himself as Dr. Jeff Davis, an investigator with the State Department of Health. He'd spent the entire morning interviewing family members of the 3 women affected by this mystery disease. Joan stood up immediately and thanked him and said, "Please come in and sit down," but Dr. Davis just shook his head and said he couldn't stay. He just wanted Joan to know that he did find a link between the 3 cases. Dr. Davis explained that the 3 patients had almost nothing in common. They didn't eat the same things, they didn't go to the same places, or lived similar lifestyles. The only thing they shared was the fact that they were all young women. And so he thought that they could have something in common biologically, and he'd wondered if maybe they had all been menstruating at the time they got sick. So he checked their charts and learned that yes, all 3 were having their period when their symptoms developed. Also, Rose, who was now able to speak, would tell Dr. Davis that she actually remembered getting a similar looking rash on her body the month before when she had her period the last time. This was a promising link, but Dr. Davis said he didn't know what it meant, or if it was even relevant at all. After he was done speaking, Dr. Davis just looked at Joan expectantly, as though she could now solve the mystery. But Joan wasn't sure what to say. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about a period that would make these women so sick. But Joan knew that this connection was really all they had to go on, so she couldn't just dismiss the theory outright. And so instead, she took a seat and picked up Dr. Davis's notes from all the family meetings he had just had, and she began to read over them.
Zo krachtig en groot. De rivieren stromen wild en vrij. O natuur, jouw kracht zo puur. In elke bloem, in elke boom.
The next morning, Joan stepped into her office to find the lab results sitting on her desk. She felt a rush of energy as she grabbed them and began scanning the documents in her hand. It would turn out both of her patients, Rose and the 15-year-old girl, had tested positive for a life-threatening infection from bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. This was the same bacteria that infected the girls in the Lancet article Joan had read, which meant Rose and the 15-year-old girl had the new syndrome outlined in the article, which the researchers named toxic shock syndrome. Joan breathed a small sigh of relief. At least she knew what she was treating now. She hoped that with enough specialized care, both of her patients lying in the ICU would make a full recovery. But Joan still had a very big problem. She still didn't know how her patients could have contracted the deadly staph infection in the first place. They had no open wounds, no place for the bacteria to enter the bloodstream. She remembered Dr. Davis's observation that all the women were on their periods at the time. Joan wondered if Rose and the 15-year-old girl had taken a contaminated painkiller to alleviate their cramps, and maybe that's why they got sick. But this was only a theory, and until doctors figured it out, more people would likely get sick. Joan hoped Dr. Davis and the other investigators at the Department of Health would be able to find the cause quickly. About 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in late February 1980, an epidemiologist at the National Centers for Disease Control named Bruce Dan drove to work feeling completely at a loss. He had spent almost 2 months trying to find the cause of the toxic shock infections in Madison, Wisconsin, and other locations all over the United States. To date, no one could figure out what was causing the illness or how to stop what was now a nationwide epidemic. By now, the mysterious infections had become national news. And as Dr. Dan pulled into the parking lot at the CDC, a story about toxic shock came on the radio. He listened as the reporter summarized the stats that Dr. Dan had already memorized. Since early December, 107 cases of toxic shock had surfaced in 33 states around the country. Thankfully, no deaths have been reported yet. Dr. Dan switched off the radio, parked his car, and walked to his office in silence. As he said good morning to his secretary handed him a stack of memos. This had become routine. because ever since the newspapers, TV, and radio started publishing daily reports on toxic shock, Dr. Dan had received hundreds of calls from women all across the country experiencing similar symptoms. Dr. Dan thanked the secretary and was about to leave when she stopped him and she handed him one more memo. He looked down at it, and as he read it, his stomach dropped. That morning, a young woman living in Wisconsin had become the first person to die from this mysterious infection. This woman was not one of Joan's patients, so she was not Rose or the 15-year-old girl, and in fact, by this point, Rose and the 15-year-old girl had actually fully recovered and were back with their families. But now it was clear to Dr. Dan that this infection could turn deadly, and Dr. Dan had been too late to stop it. He walked into his office so upset he wanted to kick his desk chair. He had always been very motivated to solve this mystery, but now his motivation was through the roof. He decided it was time for drastic action. He would find the answer to this riddle no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Dan and his team made thousands of phone calls interviewing women who were being treated for toxic shock. They also talked to young women who were not getting sick for comparison. At the end of each day, Dr. Dan would spend hours in his office reading the notes taken during each of these calls, searching for anything that stood out. Meanwhile, the number of toxic shock cases mounted. Within a month, more than 100 serious cases had been reported, and this only motivated Dr. Dan to work harder and stay later, losing himself in his notes. And finally, after 4 weeks of hard work, Dr. Dan found a link. He discovered that all the women who developed toxic shock syndrome used tampons when they menstruated, not pads. Dr. Dan sat at his desk, scratching his chin. He knew he was onto something. Granted, tampons had been on the market for more than 50 years. In fact, 50 million women used them every month in the United States alone. Out of that 50 million, only several hundred had gotten sick. So clearly, the vast majority of tampons were causing no problem at all. Dr. Dan rapped his pen on the desk, thinking, and he wondered maybe it was just one brand of tampons that had somehow become contaminated in some way. And so he decided to begin calling tampon manufacturers, and what he found would finally solve the mystery. As Dr. Dan and his colleagues conducted their surveys, they discovered that in about 70% of the toxic shock cases, the women used tampons from a brand called Rely. Specifically, they used the heavily absorbent version. At first, this didn't make sense to Dr. Dan. Rely had introduced the heavily absorbent tampons 6 years earlier, in 1974, but there was no evidence linking them to toxic shock until this outbreak had started in late 1979. However, right before the outbreak began, Rely began using synthetic materials. And the other brands, which accounted for the other 30% of toxic shock cases, also were using synthetic materials, just not as much. It turned out that while these materials allowed for much better absorbency, they also helped promote the growth of the bacteria that causes toxic shock. Once Dr. Dan discovered the link between Rely tampons and toxic shock, the CDC published an article with their findings. For Dr. Joan Chesney and her husband Russell, the study was a huge relief. Thankfully, all their patients had fought off the deadly infection, and now that the word was out, they were hopeful the outbreak would taper off. After some initial resistance, Rely superabsorbent tampons were finally pulled from the shelves in September of 1980. By that point, 772 women had developed toxic shock syndrome from using tampons, and the majority of them used Rely tampons. Tragically, 38 of those women died. Their deaths inspired new industry regulations to reduce the absorbency of tampons and also to print mandatory warning labels on the boxes. And since then, toxic shock syndrome has become incredibly rare, with only a handful of deaths every year.
Every moment we together, from the dawn to twilight's glow, I'll love all I ever know. In your eyes I find my way, De wind fluistert zacht door de velden heen. De wolken dansen in de blauwe lucht. Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw plaats zo puur. In elke bloem, in elke boom. Oh, natuur, jouw hart zo groot. Jij bent de ziel van ons bestaan.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, MrBallen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis.